I never expected 3 bulldozers would block my driveway that morning, or that Nancy from the HOA would be smirking behind them. But they had no idea who they were messing with, or that I literally owned the ground beneath their feet. What would you do if you discovered your annoying HOA was not only harassing you illegally but stealing thousands from your neighbors? I still remember the day everything changed. The morning sun warmed my back as I knelt in the soft dirt along my driveway, planting the last of my tomato seedlings. After 15 years working 80-hour weeks at my law firm, I'd finally found peace in growing things. The feel of soil between my fingers and the promise of fresh vegetables kept me sane. "Excuse me, what do you think you're doing?" I looked up to see Nancy Williams standing at the edge of my property. Her arms crossed tightly over her designer blouse. Her perfectly highlighted hair didn't move in the breeze, and her lips were pressed into a thin, disapproving line. "Good morning, Nancy," I said, wiping my hands on my gardening apron. "Just expanding my vegetable garden a bit." Her eyes narrowed as she surveyed the neat rows of raised beds that now lined the side of my driveway. "This is completely unacceptable. James, Front Yards in Willow Creek Estates. Must be properly landscaped with approved plants only. Vegetable gardens belong in backyards hidden from view." I took a deep breath. Nancy had been the head of our homeowners association for the past 5 years, and in that time, our once friendly neighborhood had become a battleground of petty rules and surprise fines. "Nancy, my property deed predates the HOA by 30 years. I've got grandfather exemptions on most of these rules." I stood up, suddenly aware of how my dirt-stained jeans contrasted with her immaculate appearance. "That's not how it works," she snapped, pulling out her phone. "I'm documenting this violation. The board will be notified immediately." I watched as she took multiple photos, her fingers flying across her screen. 2 neighbors walking their dogs slowed down to watch the confrontation. "I've read every page of the HOA agreement," I said calmly, "and I've kept all correspondence with the previous board, acknowledging my exemptions. Would you like to see the paperwork?" She waved her hand dismissively. "Save it for the hearing. You'll be receiving a formal notice of violation by tomorrow. I suggest you remove all this." She gestured vaguely at my garden. "Mess before fines begin accumulating." As she marched away, I noticed Mr. Jenkins from across the street giving me a sympathetic look. He'd had his own run-in with Nancy last month over the color of his new mailbox, apparently forest green. Wasn't the same as the approved hunter green. That evening, true to her word, I found a bright orange violation notice taped to my front door. A 53 daily fine until the unapproved agricultural activity was removed from my front yard. The hearing was scheduled for next week. I took the notice inside and added it to my growing file labeled HOA nonsense. But something about this felt different. More targeted, more personal. My phone rang. It was Eleanor Ramos, the sweet elderly woman who'd lived down the street since before the development even had a name. "James, dear," her voice crackled through the phone. "I saw Nancy harassing you this morning. You're not the first, you know. Last month she had the board fine. The Thompsons $500 because their daughter's wheelchair ramp didn't match the architectural aesthetic of the neighborhood." My blood boiled. "That can't be legal." "It wasn't," Eleanor confirmed. "But the Thompsons couldn't afford to fight it. They paid the fine and painted the ramp. Nancy's been getting bolder since her friend Robert became the HOA's lawyer." I thanked Eleanor for the information and hung up. Sleep didn't come easily that night. The next morning, I decided to do some research before heading to work. My family had owned much of this land before selling to developers in the 1970s. I remembered my father saying something about retaining certain rights, but I'd never paid much attention. I was digging through old boxes in my attic when I heard engines outside. Heavy engines. Rushing to my front window, I froze at what I saw. 3 massive bulldozers were now parked across my driveway, completely blocking my car. Nancy stood beside them in a crisp pantsuit, accompanied by a tall man in an expensive suit I didn't recognize. A small crowd of neighbors had gathered on the sidewalk, watching with wide eyes. My heart pounded as I grabbed my phone and the folder of HOA documents. Whatever game Nancy was playing, she had just made a serious mistake. As I stepped onto my front porch, Nancy's face lit up with a triumphant smile that sent chills down my spine. The bulldozer operators sat idling their engines, waiting for instructions. "James Anderson," Nancy called out, loud enough for everyone to hear. "The board held an emergency meeting last night. Your violations are so severe that immediate action has been authorized." The man beside her stepped forward. "I'm Robert Taylor, legal counsel for Willow Creek Estates HOA. These," he gestured to my garden beds, "unauthorized structures are being removed under Section 8.3 of the bylaws. Immediate. Remedy for public nuisance." My neighbors watched in stunned silence. Mrs. Patel covered her mouth in shock. The Henderson kids stopped their bikes to stare. I walked calmly down my front steps, my mind racing through options. I needed to stall while I figured out my next move. "Mr. Taylor," I said, keeping my voice steady, "you might want to check your legal footing here. Those aren't structures. They're temporary garden beds. And more importantly, you're about to make a very, very expensive mistake." Robert's smile faltered slightly. "Your threats don't concern us. Mr. Anderson, we have the full authority of the HOA covenant." Nancy stepped forward, practically glowing with authority. "James, this stubbornness is so unnecessary. Just agree to remove the eyesores, pay the accumulated fines, which are now up to $300, and we can all move on." The bulldozer engines revved louder. The operator of the closest machine looked uncomfortable. Glancing between me and Nancy, I pulled out my phone. "Before you proceed, I should probably let you know that I'm recording this, and I've just texted my associate at the firm to join us. Oh, and you should probably know something else about this property." Nancy rolled her eyes dramatically. "Save the legal mumbo-jumbo, James. Nothing you say will stop this." Just then, a sleek black car pulled up to the curb. The neighbors parted as Sheriff Martinez stepped out, followed by a woman carrying what looked like official county records. Nancy's face showed confusion, then concern. "What's going on? We don't need law enforcement for a simple HOA matter." I smiled for the first time that morning. "Nancy, I don't think you understand exactly whose driveway you've blocked, and you definitely don't know whose land your bulldozers are parked on right now." The county clerk, Ms. Abernathy, struggled with the weight of the large property maps as she spread them across the hood of the sheriff's car. Neighbors inched closer, murmuring among themselves. The bulldozer operators had cut their engines, clearly sensing the shift in power. "These are the original survey maps from 1973, Ms. Abernathy explained, pointing to the yellowed documents. "And this is the property sale agreement between the Anderson family and Willow Creek Development Corporation." Nancy pushed forward, her confidence visibly wavering. "This is ridiculous. Whatever ancient paperwork you've dug up can't override our HOA authority." Sheriff Martinez cleared his throat. "Ma'am, I'd suggest you listen carefully to what Ms. Abernathy is about to explain." The county clerk adjusted her glasses. "According to these records, when the Anderson family sold this land for development, they retained specific rights. First, the mineral rights beneath the entire 200-acre development." Her finger traced the boundaries that encompassed our entire neighborhood. "Second, all utility easements running under the main roads. And third, most importantly, explicit exemptions from any future homeowners associations for the 5 properties they kept for family members." I stepped forward, my house being one of those 5 properties. Robert Taylor frantically flipped through papers in his briefcase. "That's impossible. The HOA covenant applies to all properties within the development. There's no mention of exemptions." Ms. Abernathy smiled patiently. "That's because your HOA was formed in 1995. Mr. Taylor, these agreements were registered with the county in 1973. Your covenant cannot override pre-existing legal arrangements." Nancy's face had turned an alarming shade of red. "This is some kind of trick. Even if James's house has some special status, he still can't violate basic community standards." "Actually," Sheriff Martinez interjected, "according to county law, he can do whatever he wants with his property as long as it doesn't violate county zoning regulations, and vegetable gardens are perfectly legal in residential zones." The crowd had grown larger. I noticed Mr. Jenkins recording everything on his phone. Mrs. Patel was translating the situation to her elderly father in hushed tones. Nancy turned to the bulldozer operators. "This changes nothing. Proceed with removal as planned." The lead operator shook his head. "Sorry, ma'am. I'm not risking my license on disputed property. Not without a court order." "I'll get one," Nancy snapped. "Today." I stepped closer to Nancy and Robert, lowering my voice. "There's something else you should know. Those bulldozers are currently parked on an easement that, according to these documents, belongs to me. That's trespassing on private property. And since you brought them here with clear intent to damage my property, I let the implication hang in the air." Robert grabbed Nancy's arm, whispering urgently in her ear. Her eyes widened with something that looked like fear. "Sheriff," I said calmly, "I'd like to file a report for attempted property damage and trespassing." Sheriff Martinez nodded. "We can take care of that right now." "This is outrageous!" Nancy exploded. "The HOA has governed this neighborhood for decades. You can't just suddenly claim special privileges." "It's not sudden, Nancy," came a frail voice from the crowd. Eleanor Ramos made her way forward, leaning heavily on her cane. "Some of us have known about the Anderson exemptions all along. The old board respected them. But when you took over," Nancy glared at Eleanor. "Stay out of this!" "Your Christmas decorations violation hearing is next week. Or have you forgotten?" Several neighbors gasped at Nancy's open threat to the beloved 82-year-old widow. Eleanor smiled sweetly. Oh, I haven't forgotten anything, dear. In fact, my memory is quite excellent. I remember when your husband built that shed 2 feet over the Johnson property line. And when you had Robert here dismiss the violation because, what was it again? Administrative discretion? The crowd began to murmur more loudly. Nancy's face flushed, deeper as she looked around at the growing number of hostile faces. Robert Taylor checked his watch nervously. Nancy, we should continue this discussion in private. Perhaps we could schedule a proper hearing. There will be no hearing, I interrupted. My property is exempt from your authority. Those bulldozers need to be removed from my easement immediately, or I'll add additional charges to my complaint. Sheriff Martinez stepped forward. Folks, let's keep things civil. Ms. Williams, Mr. Taylor, I suggest you direct these operators to remove their equipment. Mr. Anderson, if you'd like to file that report, we can do so once the area is cleared. Nancy looked around desperately, realizing she was losing control of the situation and her audience. The neighbors who had once feared her now watched with open curiosity and satisfaction. This isn't over, she hissed at me. Not by a long shot. As the bulldozers began backing away from my driveway, Eleanor touched my arm gently. James, dear, there's something important you should know. It's about the HOA financial records. What about them? I asked quietly. Eleanor glanced around cautiously. Not here. Too many ears. Come by my house this evening. Bring those old property documents. I think we've only scratched the surface of what Nancy has been up to. As Nancy and Robert retreated to their waiting car, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. Genuine fear in their eyes. Whatever they had been trying to hide by removing my garden so hastily, they now realized they might have awakened something much more dangerous than a simple property dispute. The last bulldozer rumbled away, leaving my tomato plants untouched. Sheriff Martinez approached with his citation book. Want to file that report now? I watched Nancy's car speed away. Absolutely. And Sheriff, you might want to contact the county prosecutor. I have a feeling this is going to involve more than just trespassing. Charges before we're done. Eleanor squeezed my hand. 7 o'clock tonight, she whispered. And James, bring a calculator. You'll need it when you see what I've found. The neighbors began to disperse, many stopping to examine my garden beds with new interest. Whatever Nancy had intended, she had inadvertently turned my modest vegetable garden into a symbol of resistance. I had simply wanted to grow tomatoes in peace. Now, I was about to uncover something that would change our entire community forever. Blood rushed to my face as the bulldozer's engines roared in front of my house. My neighbors peeked through their curtains, watching the drama unfold. I needed to act fast. With shaking hands, I called the one person who could help me right now. County Clerk's office, this is Martha speaking. Martha, it's James Anderson. Remember those old land deeds we discussed last month? I need them at my house immediately. It's an emergency. Nancy strutted around my front yard like she owned it, pointing at my garden beds and gesturing wildly to the bulldozer operators. The taller man in the suit, Robert, kept nodding and checking something on his clipboard. You have exactly 30 minutes to say goodbye to your little farm, Nancy called out, her voice dripping with fake sweetness. Maybe next time you'll learn to follow the rules like everyone else. I stood my ground. I suggest you don't touch anything until Martha arrives. Who's Martha? Nancy snapped, her smile faltering slightly. You'll see. The next 20 minutes were excruciating. The neighbors had started to gather across the street, whispering among themselves. Some looked sympathetic, others seemed to enjoy the show. I noticed Mrs. Jenkins from across the street filming everything on her phone. Martha's county vehicle pulled up exactly 27 minutes later. She wasn't alone. She'd brought the entire property records, team, and 4 huge boxes of documents. Nancy's smug expression wavered. What's all this? Robert asked, stepping forward with his hand extended. I'm Robert Taylor, HOA legal counsel. Martha ignored his hand. Martha Gonzalez, county clerk. I understand there's a property dispute occurring on historically significant land. I couldn't help but smile as I helped Martha spread the yellowed maps and documents across the hood of my car. The oldest one dated back to 1887, my great-great-grandfather's original land purchase. Ms. Williams, Martha said, adjusting her glasses as she pointed to a boundary line on the oldest map. Are you familiar with the Anderson Land Trust, established in 1923? Nancy crossed her arms. This is ridiculous. We have HOA bylaws that clearly state the bylaws don't override county law, Martha interrupted. Or state law, for that matter. I pointed to a specific paragraph on one of the newer documents. This is the land sale contract from 1978, when my grandfather sold the parcels that became Willow Creek Estates. See this clause right here? Robert snatched the paper, his eyes widening as he read. It states that while the surface land was sold for development, the Anderson family retained all mineral rights and utility easements, Martha explained. Additionally, the original homestead, Mr. Anderson's current property is exempt from any future neighborhood covenants. That's impossible, Nancy sputtered, her face turning an alarming shade of red. Remember that special infrastructure fee everyone in Willow Creek pays to the county each year? I asked quietly. That money goes to my family trust as payment for using the utility easements we still legally own. The bulldozer operators exchanged nervous glances. One of them turned off his engine. Those bulldozers, I continued, pointing to the massive machines blocking my driveway, are currently parked directly above my legal utility easement. That's trespassing on my property. Nancy lunged toward the documents. Let me see that! This has to be some kind of trick. At that moment, a police cruiser pulled up, lights flashing. Sheriff Martinez stepped out, looking grim. He nodded to me before turning to Nancy. Ms. Williams, I've received reports of attempted property destruction and trespassing at this address. This is HOA business, Nancy hissed. The police have no jurisdiction over. Actually, Sheriff Martinez said, pulling out his citation book. When Mr. Anderson's grandfather sold this land, he included a special provision that all disputes would fall under county jurisdiction, not private HOA arbitration. Robert's professional demeanor crumbled. Nancy, we need to stop this now, if what they're saying is true. It can't be true, Nancy shouted, but I could see the fear in her eyes. The growing crowd of neighbors gasped as another car pulled up behind the sheriff's vehicle. Mrs. Jenkins was live streaming everything now, her phone held high. James? Nancy's voice had suddenly turned sugary sweet as she used my first name. Surely we can discuss this reasonably. Sheriff Martinez approached, citation book open. I'm going to need those bulldozers moved immediately. The operators were already climbing back into their machines, eager to distance themselves from this mess. But what happened next left everyone speechless. The back door of the car behind the sheriff opened, and a familiar figure stepped out. Someone nobody expected to see. Someone who would change everything about this fight. Stop those machines right now! The voice that rang out belonged to Eleanor Ramos, the 83-year-old widow who lived 3 doors down. She leaned heavily on her cane as she made her way toward us, but her eyes were fierce. Nancy rolled her eyes. Eleanor, go back home. This doesn't concern you? Doesn't concern me? Eleanor's laugh was sharp. When you threatened to fine me, $500 for my Christmas lights last December, you made it my concern. I hadn't seen much of Eleanor since I'd helped her with some paperwork after her husband died last winter. She'd been a quiet neighbor, mostly keeping to herself. Mrs. Ramos, Sheriff Martinez said gently. Perhaps you should. I'm exactly where I need to be. Eleanor cut him off. She turned to me. James, show them the map from 1978. I blinked in surprise, but quickly found the document she wanted. Eleanor pointed a gnarled finger at a section of Willow Creek Estates. See these 12 properties? Mine included. We were all part of the original purchase agreement. James isn't the only one with exemptions from HOA oversight. Martha leaned in, adjusting her glasses. She's right. The original homesteads all carry the same protections. Nancy's face contorted. That's absurd. The HOA has been regulating those properties for years. Illegally, Eleanor said simply. She turned toward the growing crowd of neighbors. Harold! Susan! Derek! You're all originals too. 3 older residents stepped forward, looking confused but curious. Is this true? Asked Harold Fisher, who'd lived at the corner house for decades. They can't make me remove my ham radio antenna? Or fine me for my bird feeders? Susan Winters added. I watched as recognition dawned on their faces. For years, they'd been bullied by the HOA, paying fines they never needed to pay, altering their homes to meet regulations that didn't apply to them. Robert pulled Nancy aside, whispering urgently in her ear. Her expression darkened with each word. Eleanor wasn't finished. She addressed the crowd directly. How many of you have been harassed by this HOA? Fined for ridiculous violations? Threatened with legal action for minor issues? Hands went up. Throughout the crowd, Mrs. Jenkins' livestream comment counter was exploding with responses. This isn't just about James's garden, Eleanor continued. It's about how this HOA, under Nancy's leadership, has abused its power repeatedly. Sheriff Martinez nodded. I've received more complaints about this HOA in the past year than all others in the county combined, threatening elderly residents with excessive fines, ticketing guests' vehicles without warning, entering properties without permission. Nancy pushed past Robert, her face twisted with anger. These allegations are completely false. We enforce the rules everyone agreed to when they moved here. Except we didn't all agree, I said quietly. And you knew that, didn't you? The tension in the air was thick enough to cut. The bulldozer operators had completely backed away from my driveway now, clearly wanting no part in this escalating situation. This isn't over, Nancy hissed at me. The board will hear about this, and will take appropriate action. Speaking of the board, Eleanor said, reaching into her large handbag. "I have something everyone should see." She pulled out a thick manila folder and handed it to me. As I opened it, my legal training immediately recognized what I was looking at. Bank statements, transfer records, articles of incorporation. "Where did you get this?" I asked Eleanor in shock. "My late husband was an accountant for 50 years, she replied with a small smile. "When they fined me for my Christmas lights, I got curious about where all that money was going. Started requesting public records. I flipped through the documents, each page more damning than the last. The HOA had been collecting special assessment fees from every household for a community pool renovation that never happened. Over $300,000 had disappeared into a company called WCE Holdings LLC. I turned to the last page, the LLC registration document. The managing members were listed clearly: Robert Taylor and Nancy Williams. Nancy saw what I was looking at and lunged for the folder. "That's private HOA business." Sheriff Martinez stepped between us. "Ma'am, I suggest you step back right now." As community members gathered closer, eager to see what had caused such a reaction, Robert quietly slipped away toward his car. "These are serious allegations," Martha said, looking over my shoulder at the documents. "If these records are accurate, this goes beyond HOA disputes into criminal territory." Nancy's confident facade finally cracked completely. "You have no idea who you're dealing with," she snarled at me. "My husband plays golf with Judge Brennan every Sunday. This will all disappear by tomorrow." I held her gaze steadily. "You might want to check the news." "Nancy," Judge Brennan announced. "His retirement last week after the ethics investigation." A murmur went through the crowd. Mrs. Jenkins zoomed in with her phone. Eleanor placed a gentle hand on my arm. "There's more," she whispered. "So much more." As the sheriff began taking statements from neighbors about HOA abuses, I wondered just how deep this corruption went, and who else might be involved. Whatever happened next would change our community forever. My hands trembled as I opened Eleanor's folder. Inside were bank statements with bright yellow sticky notes marking strange numbers. The HOA had been taking extra money, $300 a month from each house, for a pool renovation. But the pool looked exactly the same as it had 3 years ago. "Over $300,000 missing," I whispered, running my finger down the column of numbers. "Where did all this money go?" Eleanor leaned closer. "Keep turning pages, James." The next paper showed money moving to a business called Williams Taylor Consulting. I looked up at Eleanor, my mouth hanging open. "Nancy Williams and Robert Taylor," she said, her voice barely audible. "They've been taking our money for years." "How did you find this?" I asked, still shocked at what I was seeing. Eleanor's eyes sparkled with a mix of sadness and pride. "My Frank was an accountant for 42 years before he passed. He taught me how to read these statements. When Nancy fined me, $200 for leaving my Christmas lights up 2 days too long, I got angry. So I started looking at the HOA papers they send us every month that nobody reads." I pulled out my phone. "We need to tell everyone right now." "Wait," Eleanor said, placing her hand on mine. "There's more. Look at the last page." The final document showed that Nancy and Robert had plans to use the HOA rules to force 5 elderly homeowners to sell their houses at below-market prices. My blood ran cold when I saw they planned to buy the properties through their company and flip them for double the price. "They're targeting people who can't fight back," Eleanor said. "People like me who live alone, who might get scared by legal threats." Sheriff Martinez, who had been listening quietly, shook his head. "This goes beyond HOA problems. This is fraud." I stood up straight, my decision made. "I'm calling an emergency neighborhood meeting, tonight." 3 hours later, I stood in our crowded clubhouse. People sat in chairs, stood against walls, and even crowded by the windows outside to hear. I had connected my laptop to the big screen on the wall, showing the evidence page by page. "These people we trusted to run our community have stolen over $300,000, I said, my voice steady despite my racing heart. "Money that was supposed to fix our pool, our roads, our playground." Gasps filled the room as I showed where the money had gone. When I revealed the plan to push out elderly neighbors, angry shouts erupted. "Where are Nancy and Robert now?" someone called out. "They were invited to this meeting but chose not to come," I replied. "Their absence speaks volumes." Mr. Jenkins, a retired judge who lived on the corner, stood up. "I move that we vote immediately to remove the entire board and elect temporary leaders until we can hold proper elections." The vote was unanimous, 76 hands, raised to dissolve the current HOA board. As neighbors lined up to sign the legal documents I'd prepared, my phone buzzed in my pocket. The screen showed Nancy's name. I stepped outside to take the call. "You've ruined everything," she said, her voice a mix of anger and panic. "Do you have any idea what you've done? You think you've won because your family once owned some dirt around here?" "This isn't about winning, Nancy," I replied calmly. "This is about doing what's right." "Right?" She laughed, but it sounded hollow. You don't know who you're dealing with, James. Your precious little garden is just the beginning of what I can take from you. Before I could respond, the line went dead. I stood in the cool evening air, wondering what she meant. What could she possibly do now that the whole neighborhood knew the truth? Back inside, people were already forming committees. One to audit all HOA finances, another to review and simplify the community rules. Eleanor sat at a table, surrounded by neighbors hanging on her every word as she explained how she uncovered the scheme. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Check your security cameras now. I pulled up the app showing the video feed from my house. What I saw made my stomach drop. Two figures in dark clothing were at my front yard. Even in the dim light, I could make out Nancy's blonde hair and Robert's tall frame. They were pulling up my garden plants and throwing them across the lawn. I showed Sheriff Martinez, who immediately called for a patrol car to head to my house. But as we watched, Nancy looked directly at the camera, smiled, and made a slashing motion across her throat before they both got into a car and sped away. As people crowded around to see my phone screen, another text came through. This is just the beginning. By the time I'm done, you'll wish you never planted a single seed. Can you arrest them for this? I asked the sheriff. Trespassing, vandalism, and with these threats, possibly more. He nodded. But James, be careful. People who feel cornered can be dangerous. Eleanor put her frail hand on my arm. You're not alone anymore. None of us are. As I looked around at the determined faces of my neighbors, people who had been strangers just days ago, I realized she was right. Nancy and Robert had the money and had held the power for years. But we had something stronger, the truth and each other. My phone buzzed again. Another text, this time with a photo attachment. I opened it and felt the blood drain from my face. It was a picture of old documents, the very ones that proved my property's exemptions. Across the image, someone had written in red, "Originals burn so easily." I woke to the sound of breaking glass. Racing downstairs, I found my kitchen window smashed and my garden completely destroyed. My security camera caught Nancy and Robert ripping up my plants at 3 a.m. I texted Eleanor immediately. Within an hour, 5 news vans parked outside my house. The reporter asked, "Is it true the HOA president destroyed your property after you exposed her theft?" By noon, 30 neighbors showed up with plants and shovels. "We're with you," said Mrs. Jenkins, who I barely knew. Nancy tried to fine me $500 for my bird feeder last month. Sheriff Martinez arrived with papers in hand. Nancy and Robert have been arrested. The county found $300,000 missing from HOA accounts. The neighbors voted that day to create a new friendly neighbors group instead of an HOA. We wrote fair rules together that let people garden and be themselves. 2 months later, we held a huge block party in what used to be Nancy's yard. Her house was sold after she went to jail, and the new family loved our community garden idea. "You changed everything," Eleanor said, handing me the first tomato of the season. I smiled. I never wanted to own the county. I just wanted to grow my vegetables in peace.